Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual conference, Knowing That as Knowing How, a Neurocognitive account by Gualtiero Piccinini. This conference is hosted by 3 research projects from the Department of Philosophy at Universidad Alberto, Hurtado, funded by the Chilean National Agency for Research and Development, ANID. These are the project Concepts, Causal Connections, and Testable Predictions in Experimental Neuroscience, a case of non-exploratory and theory-oriented research in Chilean visual neuroscience, led by Professor Juan Manuel Garrido. The project, The Philosophy of Neuroscience as a Conceptual Framework for Neurorights, led by me, Abel, by Norman Paz, and associated with Neuroethics, UAH. And the project Epistemological and Metaphysical Implications of Cognitive Penetrability in Visual Perception, led by Professor Francisco Pereira. We are really honored to have Gualtiero with us today, as he's one of the leading researchers in the philosophy of neuroscience and cognitive science, with very original and stimulating views on fundamental aspects related to the conceptual foundations of cognitive neuroscience, such as neural computation, information processing, neural representations, and the ontology of neural mechanisms, among many others. Gualtiero Piccinini is Curator's Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Associate Director of the Center for Neurodynamics at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. In 2014, he received a Herbert Simon Award from the International Association for Computing and Philosophy. In 2018, he received the K. John Barwise Prize from the American Philosophical Association. In 2019, he received the Counselor's Award for Research and Creativity from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. His publications include Physical Computation, a Mechanistic Account, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, and Neurocognitive Mechanisms, Explaining Biological Cognition, also published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Gualtiero, thank you so much for joining us. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. I'm going to try to share my slides so that you can see them. Here they are. Let me know if there's anything that doesn't work. Otherwise, I'm going to get going. And this is a joint project with Stephen Hetherington, who's an epistemologist at University of New South Wales. And it's an attempt to combine epistemological topics with cognitive neuroscience and the philosophy of cognitive neuroscience to give an account of the relation between knowing that and knowing how, which of course presupposes an attempt to understand knowledge in terms of what the brain does. So it's a big topic, and I just want to point out that it builds on previous work by me, including one of the books that you mentioned before, Abel. And there's a couple of recent papers that I'm also going to be building on. I just want to mention them in case anybody is interested in looking them up. And of course, one more thing. There's a lot of other work by other people that has been influential, that has had an impact, and I'm not going to be able to acknowledge them all. But there's a draft of this paper in which there are more references if anybody wants to see it. It's still a work in progress. I'm still working on it, but there's a current draft that I shared with some of you. So, as you probably know, there are 2 main types of knowledge that epistemologists think about, worry about, talk about: knowing how, which is knowing how to do things, such as driving a car, and knowing that, which is propositional knowledge, knowing that things are thus and so, or for example, knowing that the dog is barking. And in this case, you actually maybe briefly saw my dog who was licking me, wasn't barking, luckily. Hopefully she's not going to bark. Otherwise, it will disrupt our talk. But if she barks, I'm going to have to put her in another room. Okay. So these are just the 2 main notions that we're going to be dealing with. Of course, there may be other types of knowledge too, but we're going to focus on these 2. So there are 3 main accounts of the relationship between these 2. Maybe the most prominent historically is intellectualism, And it's the view that knowing how is a kind of knowing that. That's a view that more recently has been defended prominently by Jason Stanley and Timothy Williamson. Then there is moderate intellectualism, which says that the two kinds of knowledge are distinct and mutually reducible. Each one is its own kind of knowledge. It does not, you cannot really account for it or explain it or reduce it or analyze it in terms of the other. Gilbert Ryle is the most prominent, historically at least, proponent of that view, and there are many others up to this day. And then there's a view that very few people have tried to defend, and that's a radical anti-intellectualism, which Stephen Hetherington calls practicalism. And that's the view that knowing that is a kind of knowing how. And that's the view that we're going to defend by appealing to our understanding of neurocognitive mechanisms and the type of representation and computation that they possess. So in a nutshell, the idea is that knowing that P, knowing that, and for example, knowing that P is knowing how to represent that P, as well as ground such a representation in the fact that P, as well as use such a representation to guide action with respect to P, and also exercising that know-how when needed. Okay, so that's the basic idea, and I'm going to spend some time articulating that and defending that. And let me say a little bit more about what this amounts to. So we're going to distinguish between an implicit type of knowing that and an explicit form of knowing that. Maybe it would be better to tell you what we mean by implicit and explicit first, and then I'll say a little bit more about how the account goes. So what do we mean by explicit versus implicit representation? Because this is important, because in this literature, often implicit is equated with procedural, and explicit is equated with declarative. And so then another move, or another standard kind of way of thinking about it, I'll mention it later, is to map knowing that to declarative memory, declarative knowledge in the brain, which then is also considered to be more or less equivalent to explicit representation or explicit knowledge. And then on the other hand, map knowing how to procedural representation, which then is also considered to be more or less equivalent to implicit. And we don't do that. Okay, so I'll say a little bit more about the relation between knowledge and declarative versus procedural. But at the moment, it's important to know that when we say implicit and explicit, we mean something else. We mean a different distinction, and not that we made this distinction ourselves, but there's different ways of drawing the distinction. This is the one we use. It's that an explicit representation is a type of representation the agent can express through language at relatively low computational cost, meaning it's kind of relatively ready to be expressed in its own representational format in the brain, in the neurocognitive system. Whereas an implicit representation, it's a type of representation that either cannot be expressed through language in propositional form, or if it can, it has to first be decoded through a explicit representation. So at first it has to be turned into a explicit representation, which requires relatively intensive computational processing, and then it can be expressed in propositional form. Okay, I hope this makes sense. But the basic idea is that if it's implicit, it's there, it represents things, but there's no clear, easy way to express it in propositional form. Whereas if it's an explicit representation, it can be expressed in language easily without too much processing. Okay, so the account is this. Neurocognitive systems control organisms by building internal models of their environments and using such models to guide actions. That's kind of just a basic premise about how brains work and what they do. These internal models implicitly represent how things are. And when these implicit models are grounded in the facts and are usable for guiding action with respect to those facts, and when they're, the agents are ready to use them when needed, then agents have an implicit form of knowing that. That's a account of implicit knowing that. And then when such systems acquire the ability to process language, they also acquire an additional layer of internal representations, and those have the capacity to explicitly represent that things are a certain way. And when those are also grounded in the facts and usable for guiding action, and that those kinds of representations are used when needed, then the agents have an explicit form of knowing that. Okay, so this may or may not be super clear, but hopefully it will be clear by the end of the talk. It's just to tell you where we're going. Now, how do we get there? We get there, first of all, by a slight polemic with a way that the literature has evolved in recent decades. And that is by often prioritizing semantic analysis of our knowledge attributions versus explicitly thinking about neural mechanisms or neurocognitive mechanisms. So, so people have argued that we can analyze knowing how in terms of knowing that in the following way, kind of summarized here by capital I. A knows how to X if and only if A knows that W is a way to X. So you can see that this locution, knowing A knows how to X, which is attributing knowing how to an agent, according to this analysis, can be cashed out in terms of a knowing that something is the case. Okay, and what that is that there is a way W of doing X or to X. Okay, but that is embedded in a that clause, so it's a form of knowing that. And then this kind of view has been defended by appealing to semantic analysis, the meaning of knowledge attributions. But the problem is that knowledge attributions, epistemic idioms, are very flexible. And as we will argue, we could do the reverse. We can do we can offer a semantic analysis of an agent knowing that P in terms of that agent knowing how to represent that P in a certain way. Okay, and I gave you the more extended version, meaning knowing how to represent that P, ground the representation in the fact that P, be able to guide the guide action on the basis of that representation, and then be able to exercise those capacities. But I'm going to abbreviate that in this way, called PR for practicalism, for the sake of brevity, so that I can show you that these two things are not really gonna get us very far. And one way to see that is by trying to combine them. So if you try to combine these two, you get into an infinite regress. I'll just show you really briefly. I mean, this is just to motivate why we have to go beyond semantic analysis, okay? So it's not like a super crucial point, but it helps to motivate our approach. So here's what happens if you iterate, okay? Start with an agent knows how to X. Then you apply the intellectualist analysis. That means the agent knows that there's a W, and a W is a way to X. Okay, this is from the account that I gave, in the previous slide here. You apply that, you get, the second statement here. Now you apply the practicalist analysis to this, and you get, well, A knows how to represent that W is a way to X in the right sort of way. And you can keep going, and you can apply the intellectualist analysis again. A knows that W prime is a way to represent that W is a way to X. And then you can apply the practicalist analysis again. You get A knows how to represent that W prime is a way to represent that W is a way to X. And you can keep going as long as you want. And, you know, you can never get to the bottom of anything. In fact, the analysis gets longer and longer. Obviously, you know, intellectualists would prioritize their own analysis, but then practicalists or, you know, radical intellectualists would prioritize their own analysis. And how do we get out of this? Well, the way to get out of this is to study or think about how knowledge actually works in the brain, in the neurocognitive system. What are the mechanisms involved? How do they work? And what's the best way to think about them? What's the best way to characterize them? Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. And to do that, we need to think a little bit about representations in the brain. There is a large body of literature, recent literature on this that we're building on, that I've contributed to a little bit. The basic notion that is adopted by most of the people who have thought about this topic or contributed to this topic is the notion of so-called structural representations. That's not the end of the story, but it's the beginning of the story about how what kind of representation are relevant to explaining cognition and what kind of representations are to be found in the brain. So this is a sort of basic notion that is recognized by most people in this area as relevant and also as robust enough that it counts as a genuine notion of representation. And it has these features. There's like some variation in how how it's defined, but I think this is going to work well for us. So a system of internal states with the following functions is a system of structural representations. So the states are partially isomorphic to a target. That's what the representation is supposed to represent. They carry natural semantic information about their targets, meaning that when the representation is active, it raises the probability that the target is is the way it's represented to be. So notice this is indicative representation. There's also imperative representation. We're not talking about that so much right now, although I've written a little bit about that. But this is indicative representation, representing things as being a certain way. It's activated by signals from the target under normal conditions. It can be decoupled from the target so that it can also be activated without signals from the target reaching it. And it can guide behavior with regards to the target. Okay, so that's not an especially controversial notion, structural representations. I do want to add that there's additional special features of neural representations. So what I call a neural structural representation in biological systems is a situated structural representation or system of structural representations acquired by learning, which simulate their targets. So let me say a couple of things about each one of these. It's situated because it's produced, it's built, it's learned by a system that is embodied in an organism and embedded in an environment, and that is constantly interacting with the body and the environment, is constantly getting feedback from the body and the environment, and using that feedback and the the correlations and the interdependencies between what it does in terms of controlling the body and moving the body and moving within the environment and changing the environment to some degree, and its own current state. Okay, so it's situated in this important way. The learning process relies on this situatedness. It relies on all these correlations and dependencies between the internal states and the states of the body and the states of the environment. And it simulates the target. So it's not just representing that things are a certain way right now, it's representing things as well as attempting to predict or simulate how they're going to evolve in the near future. So it's a dynamic type of representation. This is kind of the basic, some basic features of neural representations that are important for us. So neural representational systems, they build and maintain these simulations. They use the simulations to guide behavior with regards to their target. And then they, as I said, they use information from themselves, the body, and the environment in order to update and improve the simulations. And by doing this, they can acquire original semantic content. So the semantic content of these representations is not something that's just assigned by an external interpreter, like it is in many respects with our computers or even many types of artificial neural networks. It is something that is built by the system itself. So it's something that the system itself acquires and builds by building both the internal states, the system of internal states, as well as the processes that activate and manipulate these internal states. Okay, so that's the initial neural structural representation that I'm going to adopt. And there's lots of evidence that this kind of thing exists all over neurocognitive systems, in the various sensory systems and in various other higher level portions of the brain, and that they interact with each other, and that they give each other feedback, and that they guide action through the motor system. So I'm not going to give you evidence of that, but I've written about that. So including in my book, there's a whole chapter on why this stuff is in the brain. So if anybody wants more evidence, they can at least get some there. Okay, so one more important point is that although we usually discuss, knowledge by saying, especially propositional knowledge, knowing that things are a certain way, it's important to know that the content of a neural representation generally is probably better expressed by saying something like, such and such there now and will likely evolve in a certain way. This is still a rough characterization, but it tries to capture the fact that this is not in any way an explicit propositional representation, because it doesn't have the kind of structure that can be put in in the normal inferential relations with other propositional representations that linguistic sentences have, but also it has a lot more detail about what it represents, including this power to predict the evolution of the system. So in some regards, it lacks certain features of standard linguistic representations, but it also has other features that the standard linguistic representations don't have. And it's good to try to keep in mind this aspect of it. So even though sometimes I might have written that the brain is representing that P, in reality, this is at best a severe idealization, and we should always kind of have a footnote in the back of our mind that says, well, in this case, since we're talking about neural representations in general, what we mean is something more like along these lines, and not an explicit propositional representation, okay? Or even any kind of strictly propositional representation, because what it is it's a way of representing aspects of the body and environment in a rich, detailed way, as well as predict how they're going to evolve. Okay. All right. So now let me tell you why the standard way of mapping the two types of knowledge to the brain doesn't really help. The standard way of mapping it is as follows. Knowing that is mapped onto declarative memory, which is memory of events and facts, and knowing how is standardly mapped onto procedural memory, which is memory for skills and habits. So many, if not most, of recent participants in the literature those participants of the literature, those who take an interest in the brain, in cognition, like cognitive systems, and try to look for evidence that helps decide the question of the relation between knowing how and knowing that, they usually go with this kind of mapping. Okay, and as a reminder, this distinction between declarative memory and procedural memory has been around for decades, has been adopted by many memory researchers, and it's become mainstream enough that it's sometimes called the standard model of memory. That's why I call this the standard mapping, because it uses a standard model of memory, and then it maps the two types of knowledge onto the two types of memory, the two main types of memory, although actually there's other types of memory, even according to the standard model of memory. But we're going a little bit, we're simplifying things a little bit just for the sake of brevity. It doesn't really affect the argument, because so why are people interested in this? Well, the way that this mapping is often used is by pointing at some putative evidence of double dissociation or double dissociability between declarative and procedural memory, and then say, well, because since these two types of memory are dissociable, meaning you can have declarative memory without procedural memory, or you can have procedural memory without declarative memory, like classic case of HM. If you are familiar with it, he was a man who had his hippocampi and surrounding cortical tissue removed back in, I don't know, the 50s or 60s, and then he largely lost the ability to acquire new memories for events and facts. But it was shown that he could still learn some new skills, by practicing. Even though he didn't remember practicing any of these skills, he could still improve at them. So this would be an example of procedural memory that it remains to some degree, at least, while declarative memory is severely impaired or maybe like lost. Okay, so it would be in one direction of a dissociation between the two. And people use this kind of evidence to argue that, therefore, a moderate anti-intellectualism is correct, meaning the two types of memory are not reducible to each other because each has its own neural system, and the two are can be doubly dissociated. But more recent evidence really questions this this kind of argument. I don't really have time to get into that, other than saying that even the very distinction between the declarative and procedural memory has been somewhat questioned in the way that people drew it in the past. And it looks more like there are different ways of learning, especially abilities or skills. Some are slower and they kind of correspond to, they require more practice, they correspond to what people used to call procedural memory, whereas some are, faster and maybe more general, and they correspond to what people call declarative memory. But it's not like they learning different things. They can still learn the same skill, but you can learn it in different ways. Anyway, this is not like we could go into more details about this, but I don't want to take the time because I want to point out another important consideration against this whole using the standard mapping for an argument in favor of moderate intellectualism, anti-intellectualism, and that is, even if the two were doubly dissociable in a kind of strict way that supports distinguishing between the two in the way that the standard model of memory does, it would still not follow that anti-intellectualism is correct. And the reason is that procedural memory could still have an intellectualist explanation if we think about the mechanism for it and how it works. And there's a classic paper by Fodor in which he does exactly that. He argues that intellectualism is the correct account of knowing how, because knowing how amounts to having a standard, digital computational system with a processor, with a central processor, or maybe multiple central processors. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be just one, that executes instructions for how to do a certain thing. So in his account, knowing how to do something boils down to having a list of instructions for how to do that, and then executing them when you have to do that. And the execution is similar, the execution mechanism is similar to what a computer does, one of our digital computers, like the one that I'm talking to you through, what that computer does when they execute instructions, So the important point is whether or not this distinction between declarative memory and procedural memory works the way the standard model of memory supposes that it works, it still doesn't really give us an answer about the relation between knowing how and knowing that, because procedural memory could still work the way Fodor says it does. But Fodor also gives us a criterion that's very useful for when it makes the most sense to say that a mechanism has knowledge that, and when a mechanism has knowledge how. So he says that the operations that are hardwired in the computer, the primitive operations performed by the processor, those could be considered a form of knowing how. But then everything else that's built on top of that by executing instructions, that is a form of knowing that. And the reason is because the instructions say, that this is what you have to do, and then that this is what you have to do next, and that this is what you have to do next. So they kind of possess this prepositional knowledge that, you have to do this, that, and the other. Okay, so we're going to adopt this kind of criterion, roughly speaking, and then apply it to what we know about neural representations. And when we do that, we argue that neural computation and representation is best characterized as a form of knowing how. And this is by Fodor's own standards. Because, first of all, neural computations are not driven by sequences of instructions like those of computer processors. And they're also not hardwired like those that are hardwired into a computer processor. So, neither one of the Fodor's criteria apply directly, but there is a very close analogy with operations that are hardwired. But if anything, this analogy points even more clearly at the conclusion that what the brain does when it builds these representations and processes them is a form of knowing how. Why is that? Because these internal representations and computations, they are learned by the system itself. So they're not hardwired. I mean, there might be some hardwired operations. There probably are, and there probably are some hardwired representations in some neural systems. But generally speaking, neural systems are very plastic, and they start learning as soon as the system is built by development. And there are the learning process is very important. So, especially in humans, humans undergo a very long learning process. Other species might be shorter and maybe in some ways more based on hardwired operations. But either way, there's going to be learning in virtually all neurocognitive systems. And this learning occurs via interaction with and feedback from other systems in the environment. I mentioned that before. The neural representations are built and adopted and manipulated and improved at the same time that the computations are also learned, and that's why they have original semantic content. So the system is built through development in order to learn how to represent the world and its body in relation to the world, and then how to move the body in the world. And this is all, I mean, I literally characterize this as knowing how. I said, the system, what the system is built to do is knowing how to represent the world in this way. And of course, these representations have to be relatively accurate. This is a greater notion of accuracy. They're not like true or false. They have to kind of try to track the body and the environment so that the organism can behave accordingly based on how things are. So, by photo standards suitably extended, the best way to describe this as knowing how. There are no explicit instructions for how to do things that are stored and executed in this kind of system. I mean, there's memory, of course, but it's memory of how to activate appropriate representations in response to appropriate, incoming sensory signals, and then how to simulate the likely evolution of the targets of the representation. Okay, so in this kind of representation, though, there is an implicit form of knowing that. And I want to stress what do we mean by knowledge now? Knowledge that. This is something that is, it becomes kind of important at this point because, if we want to say that there's a kind of knowing that, we need to say, okay, but what do we mean by knowing that? And as you know, there is an enormous literature that discusses what knowledge is or isn't. And there's something called, excuse me, there's something called the traditional analysis, which says that knowledge is justified true belief. I wrote it here, justified true belief, that P. That's what knowledge, that P is. Now there's, of course, the Gualtiero problem, which says that justified true belief is insufficient for knowledge. So I put this little extra qualification. I actually think that there is a relatively straightforward way to solve the Gualtiero problem, and that is to tie justification to the facts that the belief is about in the right sort of way, meaning that the justification grounds the belief in the facts. So I call this factually grounded belief. And I defend this kind of account of knowledge. I ultimately think that this doesn't really make a big difference. It's not crucial, but I'm just going to go along with my own preferred way to think about knowledge because it is, what I think is the way to go. But if you have a different account of knowledge, I think you can modify the story to suit your own account. Okay. So just based on how I think about it, neurocognitive systems, as I said, know how to simulate the environment. And in order to do that, they have to ground these simulations in the facts. How do they do that? Well, that's a complicated story about how both learning works in the brain, as well as how internal representations are maintained and corrected when necessary by the neurocognitive system. There's like books on computational neuroscience written on this. But the important point, and there's plenty more that we don't fully understand. The important point is that the system does this, okay, and does this in real time by using incoming sensor information and by having already learned how to activate the right internal states in light of the incoming information. So these internal simulations that are the neural representations, they are what I call grounded in the facts. So when you have a visual representation of your visual environment, it's grounded in the facts. There's constant feedback coming from the visual system that keeps it up to date, that corrects any mistakes or inaccuracies in the simulation. So that visual representation is grounded in the visual environment. And then at the same time, this is what the system uses to guide behavior. So how do you navigate the world? Well, one important aspect of that is your visual representation of the world. It allows you to orient yourself and move your body with regards to the environment. So this is what being factually grounded amounts to, and belief is a way of calling this kind of indicative representation that we've been talking about in the traditional epistemological literature. So belief is just, essentially indicative representation, which is what we've been talking about. So what I'm trying to say here is that once you have this kind of system, which as a whole, on the whole, is best characterized as knowing how, it also includes already an implicit form of knowing that. Because, whenever a specific feature is represented in there, for example, there's like a little a green, I don't know, there's something green with a certain shape at a certain distance, in a certain direction relative to, say, the head of the organism. That is, actually just like one aspect of a much bigger internal representation that simulates the whole visual environment. But if you focus just on that, you can say implicitly the system is representing that there is, such a thing over there right now. It's, it might be slightly misleading because it's not like there's any direct way to go from that representation to a verbal expression in a propositional form of the content of that, but the information is there. So there is implicit knowledge that things are a certain way. Now, how do you get to explicit knowledge that things are a certain way? You need to add the ability to process language. And the ability to process language is another, huge topic on which there's plenty of literature, but we can just kind of think about it in neurocognitive terms as there's going to be some somewhat dedicated systems in the brain that learn how to build internal representations of the language itself and coordinate those models, those simulations of the language, those representations of the language with the pre-existing system of representations, the visual, the auditory, the olfactory, proprioceptive, and so forth. And once you have that ability to process language and coordinate it with the rest of the system, you acquire the capacity to express prepositional knowledge. So now you can filter out, specific aspects of the information that was already represented in the system, as I described it up to now, and turn it into an explicit neurolinguistic representation that can be expressed in public language form, in public propositional form. So now the system has acquired the ability to explicitly represent that things are a certain way, and that's explicit knowledge. Naturally, there's plenty to think about, with regards to exactly what kind of representation allows the system to do this. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to summarize what I've been trying to defend, which is the view that although in general, neural representations are a form of knowing how to build these internal states and ground them in the facts through the sensory system and feedback that keeps coming, and as well as guiding behavior with regards to how things are, and applying this know-how when needed. So that is a form of knowing how. In there's already a form of implicit knowledge that, because there is that information that things are a certain way. And if you add the ability to process language to this system, which humans can do when they acquire language, other creatures maybe not, so they don't really have the full ability to acquire and express explicit knowledge that, but humans can, and they do thereby acquire the ability to explicitly represent and express knowledge that things are a certain way. And the bottom line is that knowing that is a kind of knowing how. It's knowing how to build these internal representations, use them to guide behavior, ground them in the facts, and exercise these abilities when needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gualtiero, for this amazing talk. There are a lot of, I think we have a lot of questions. There are a lot of issues that I would like to discuss. Perhaps Remis, Jorge, some of you want to start the Q&A session. Do you want me to start? Okay.
Practicalism seems to be similar to pragmatism, but but also it doesn't appear to be the same, because in pragmatism the truth is defined by what is the more practical thing, and here you have an account of that representation is grounded in the fact that P. So could you refer about how practicalism is related to pragmatism? How is it different, and how is it not different?
Yes, thank you. Stephen and I have never talked about this, so I don't know what he thinks. What I would say is that although there is a thematic affinity between the two because of the emphasis on abilities and action, they are still orthogonal to one another, so that you can be a practicalist and not a pragmatist, and you can be probably you can be a pragmatist and not a practicalist, although you'd have to ask pragmatists about that. I don't consider myself a pragmatist, at least not in the strict sense of thinking that things like truth amount to what works well, or what actions are successful, or what leads to successful action. And in fact, in my account of knowledge, I start with truth makers, which are fact in the world, and then truths are made true by truth makers. So if anything, that's a pretty standard correspondence theory of truth. So that's where I would go. But practicalism, and this is a term that Stephen coined, it's not really that, I don't think it's used by other people. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on knowing how uses the term radical anti-intellectualism for this view. what I don't like about that is that it's kind of defined negatively in opposition to anti-intellectualism, but that's what they call it.
Thanks, Gualtiero. Thanks, Jorge. I realized that I haven't presented our fellows here in the Zoom session. We have here Renis Ramos Carreño and Jorge Ignacio Muñoz, who are two PhD students from our PhD program in the Universidad Alberto Hurtado, who are working on issues related to Gualtiero's work. Renis, would you like to make the following question?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It was really great. My question has to do with the concept of knowing that after we change our understanding of how linguistic cognition works. Does your view imply that there is no room for non-linguistic or non-propositional knowing that explicitly?
Yeah, if I understand the question, before you have explicit knowing that, you need to have the ability to process language. I mean, that's almost by definition, because we define explicit as a representation, an explicit representation as a representation that can be easily expressed in a linguistic propositional form. So if you don't have language, how could you have the ability to express something in linguistic propositional form with little computational cost? So the two notions go together: explicit representation and language, the ability to process language.
Thanks, Renis. Thanks, Gualtiero. I have a question also. I have a question regarding where also I am very sympathetic to your view, and I was thinking where the context sensitivity of neural mechanisms, which is, I think, is part of the situatedness of neural representation that you emphasize, may be problematic for your view. I'm not sure about this, but it's a possibility for those who are listening. Context sensitivity of neurocognitive mechanisms has been the focus of a recent discussion. So although there is some debate about how to characterize it, there is some agreement regarding the fact that when we are performing some task, different external or internal contexts change which neurocognitive operations are recruited for performing that task. For instance, which coding regime is employed to produce a representation, or which computation are executed over them. And perhaps not in all cases, but it seems plausible that in some situations, these contextual variations would be mediated by neural representations that provide information about context. That is, these representations would determine which operations are employed for manipulating other neural representations. Do you think that if this is the case, this would entail that the possibility that our know-how regarding the manipulation of representations may depend on other representations, those representing context, which may constitute some form of knowing that? Would that be problematic or trigger some kind of regress of the kind you mentioned regarding the ontological priority between knowing that and knowing how?
Wow, that's a very, very interesting question. Well, what I would be inclined to say is that whatever representations are involved in modulating, the systems that we're focusing on would also be a form of knowing how to, activate or deactivate or modulate other systems based on, internal states and incoming sensory data. So I definitely am on board with context sensitivity. It seems that, brain systems, networks of brain systems are multifunctional, and they form these like alliances or assemblies depending on what the task is. And so different parts of the system can be used for different tasks in different ways by cooperating with other subsystems. And there's plenty, I think, to figure out about how exactly the brain does this. But I think it's all compatible with this account, as long as it's all a form of knowing how. And I think, the basic basic ability is an ability to activate the right alliance between systems and in the right sort of way to form these simulations and use them to solve the task. So it's ultimately all a form of knowing how in the first instance. Then, we can maybe find implicit knowing that, and then if, once language is added, we get to explicit knowing that. But it's all aspects of this vast network of systems that know how to represent things the right way. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a good thing to think about, though. Yeah, maybe somebody should write a paper about that.
I will try. Do we have some questions from YouTube? Otherwise, do you want to make a second question, Remis or Jorge?
I do have a kind of personal question, also a question about my personal interests. If we have time to, well, in your latest book, in Neurocognitive Mechanisms, you, in the conclusion, you said, I quote, "I am not attempting to explain full-blown mental or linguistic intentionality, including the ability to represent non-existent objects like unicorns or abstractions like numbers, the ability to attach different senses to the same reference, frege, or the possession of non-natural meaning in right sense." So my big question is, do you have any updates about how do you plan to tackle on these issues in future work?
Sort of. So I mentioned one of the two papers I mentioned at the beginning, which is called Situated Neural Representation. And I forget the subtitle, but I can tell you. It's, Situated Neural Representations, Solving the Problems of Content. It's published in Frontiers in Neurorobotics, and it's open access. So if you look it up, you can find it easily. You should be able to find it easily, and it's accessible. So that I do consider that to be a potential breakthrough, if I may say so myself. And the reason is that, I argue there that we can solve all the basic problems of the semantic content of internal representations, which is not yet a full theory of intentionality, but it's like the kind of base layer of representation. The classic problems of psychosemantics, if that means anything to you. There's this like classic literature on representation, mental representations by people like Dretske, Fodor, Millikan, and so forth. And we can solve all those problems by thinking in the right way about the way the system is situated and the way the learning works in this situated system. And there's a lot more to say about this. Of course, this is just one paper, and it potentially, other people can hopefully say more. And also, I don't want to say that all the ideas in there I came up with on my own. It builds on this very important recent literature on neural representation that many people have contributed to. including people like Nick Shea or Marcel Mikulski or Johnny Lee. There's a long list, and I want to acknowledge them because they've also had an impact on my thinking, and they've kind of nudged me in this direction. But so I'm also trying to capture the direction in which this recent literature is going, has been going already, and just saying like, okay, here's where we have to go, and if we get there, you know, we've got a viable notion of internal representation with original semantic content that is causally efficacious in the relevant way, and then, you know, it can misrepresent, it represents the distal environment, and it's, you know, determinate enough for the purposes of the system. So on that basis, then I have another paper that I published a couple of years ago called Non-Natural Mental Representation, and it's in an edited volume called What is Mental Representation or something like that. And in there, I try to give at least a sketch of an account of how we can get to what Grice called non-natural meaning, but for internal representations. You know, he was talking about language, but you know, the same kind of notion you can apply to. So these are representations that are not bound to how things are right now in the environment, but they can represent things that are false, things that are non-existent. And so I try to give an account of that there. You know, there's a lot more to say in this area, a lot. So I hope somebody else helps me out here. But I do think we have the ingredients that we need, and it's a matter of working it out, you know. So yeah, I do think that we can get to an account of intentionality in terms of how the brain works.
Thank you, Gualtiero. I have a question from YouTube. I will read it aloud. Great talk. I was wondering about whether the partial isomorphism between structural representation and target wouldn't need us to independently know the target besides the structural representation. Does neural representations escape from this problem? This has parallels with Romain Brett's recent criticism of the coding metaphor.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with the last thing mentioned in the question, and I am not 100% sure that I fully understand the question. But what I'm inclined to say is that, you know, partial isomorphism is originally a mathematical concept that, you know, gets kind of applied in this kind of literature to talk about the fact that there is what could be called a similarity of structure between the internal states and the targets. So ultimately, this is going to be grounded in experimental knowledge. So you don't need any external observer or interpreter to attribute a similarity or to attribute the isomorphism or the partial isomorphism. It's there in the system, and a neuroscientist can go and record from the neurons in some way or another, and then, you know, observe, you know, which features of the environment are these neurons most responsive to, at least in this particular context, because as Abel was saying, you know, context can change what neurons are responsive to. But in this context, these neurons are most responsive. So, you know, the classic example is orientation columns in V1, you know. So, you know, V1, apparently, they're like all these orientation columns, each of them responds to just one portion of the visual field. That's just the receptive field of that column. And then within the column, there's like all these like different mini areas, and the neurons in each of the areas within the column are most responsive to bars, meaning, you know, differences in stimulation in the visual field that have some kind of edge, and they are oriented in one direction or another. And there's like all directions represented within the column. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. This is an experimental discovery in visual science. So it's not like it's a mystery, like how could there be this isomorphism? You know, it's something that was discovered and people didn't know about it. And it was kind of a major discovery that led to a Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine.
Gualtiero, there is Jorge.
We have a related question in the YouTube chat box by Professor José Tomás Alvarado. The question is, doesn't your view presupposes that you know that knowledge is being correctly grounded in the fact represented?
I agree. It's a related question. And I think the answer is also related. It's that the ground, so, you know, we are, to a first approximation, we're just kind of positing that the grounding is there. Insofar as we believe in knowledge, then, you know, we have to believe that something's grounded in the facts, you know, some internal representations. But then again, it's something we find in brains, meaning that's a lot of what experimental neuroscience is about. It's about figuring out, you know, for particular neurons, or more precisely, assemblies of neurons within the areas of the brain, of the cortex, or other neural structures. What do they most strongly respond to, at least, you know, within a certain context? And so it's just the fact that they can respond accurately to the certain features of the environment. Not only that, it's a fact that these states can continue to be active even if the stimulation from the environment is interrupted. So, you know, for a low-level example, the blind spot is something that's been experimentally studied. You know, I don't know the details of that, but I am told by collaborators who know this stuff that that it's been shown that that the visual cortex actually actively represents what it extrapolates to be in the blind spot, even though by definition there's no stimulation coming from the blind spot, even if there's only, you know, like one eye's closed, or one, you know, there's only stimulation from one eye, so there's definitely not any sensory information from the blind spot. The visual cortex still represents it, and sometimes it, you know, it gets it wrong, you know, in some special cases, but usually it gets it, you know, quite correctly, because you know, it tries to basically infer or predict from the surrounding area, the area surrounding the blind spot. You know, it's probably kind of the continuation of that, right, so to speak. Like, this is kind of an intuitive description. So the brain, you know, so that's what we use to guide our action. It's these internal representations, and they're not so bad. I mean, they're not so bad. Like, we can study this experimentally and see, like, you know, yes, okay, in this case the system got tricked, so to speak. You know, like, it's getting kind of inaccurate in this at this moment, but then it corrects itself, right? That's why we also move our eyes all the time, so that we can get information from different parts of the visual environment all the time. So this grounding is not just like assumed to be there, it's experimentally found to be there. And exactly how it works, that's, I mean, and that's an open question, right? Like, science evolves and we learn new things all the time. There's plenty that we still need to figure out, but I think that we know enough that we can tell, yes, it happens.
Thanks, Gualtiero. There is another question by Alan Oli, who says that what is the role of neural representation in habitual behavior action in this model? Are some or all of our habits outcomes of these representations?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question too. It's a little kind of beyond my competence to give a full answer to that question. It depends in part on what we mean by habits. If by habits we mean habits like I don't know, turning on your chair. If it's a chair like mine that turns, like you have the habit of just kind of turning back and forth. There's probably some relatively low level representation that is involved just because it's part of a very complex, cognitively evolved, like sophisticated system. But if by habit you include like the way that, I don't know, an ant moves its legs, maybe there's just this basic fixed action pattern or actually central pattern generator. And I think it's fair to call that maybe a motor representation, but that's all you need. Like, you don't need like any kind of simulation of anything to drive that. So there's going to be some basic central pattern generators that are involved in some of our actions. And so those are motor representations, I think it's fair to call them, but not indicative or not indicative representations, which is what I was focused on today. Yeah, so I guess that's maybe a halfway decent answer. That's a good question.
We have another question by Carlos Molina. It's a long question. It says, there is plenty of empirical evidence coming from developmental psychology and language acquisition research that humans during development are capable of representing and manipulating relatively complex propositional information, knowing that type of information and make inferences on them before acquiring language. In this case, language would be the representational medium that allows us to communicate our thoughts rather than to have them in the first place. If this is correct, knowing that is not totally dependent on acquiring language. A person without the capacity for language, for example, a deaf person not exposed to sign language, would still be capable of entertaining propositional thoughts. For example, in form of knowing that. It would be just that he or she would be incapable of communicating them. Thanks. That was the comment / question. I will paste the comment in the chat if you want to review it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thanks. That is a wait a minute. Oh, you haven't posted it yet. Oops. Well, okay, I'll try to copy it there later so that I have the whole thing. That is a great point. Great point. I don't think I thought about that before. What I would be inclined to say is that, and I might have to check in the paper how we put things, maybe we need to modify this a little bit, is that what matters is a system that has that kind of capacity to acquire language and then, form these kinds of representations. It doesn't have to have acquired the language already. And ultimately the story about neural representation is going to be not just a matter of yes or no, does it have only implicit or only explicit representation, propositional representation, because there's going to be different degrees of kind of sophistication in the representational system. Like, there are lots of species that communicate and communicate in relatively sophisticated ways. So they're going to have something that, even if it's not maybe fully propositional representation, still has, you know, a fairly sophisticated way of attaching certain actions, like certain signals, to certain pieces of information. So, you know, there's going to be intermediate cases, I would say. But I guess my own guess is that before you have full explicit propositional representation, you need something with the expressive capacity of human language, which doesn't mean that you have acquired the language, but you have to have the neurocognitive system with that ability, if that makes sense. But, you know, there's a good chance that I have to revise the paper now in light of your comment. So I really appreciate that. And in fact, I'm going to try to copy it now, so that I don't lose that.
Thank you, Gualtiero. I think that we have a very enthusiastic public in YouTube. But I don't think that there are more questions now. Do you have any additional questions, Renis, Jorge? I have one related to some personal theoretical interests, which are related to empiricist approaches to conceptual processing, to knowing that. According to grounded cognition or empiricist approaches to concepts, for instance, neural representations underlying sensory motor abilities or sensory motor skills and habits are the very same underlying declarative memory or conceptual semantic knowledge. So this view seems to have similar implications that are similar to the ones that your approach has, through an alternative path that seems also to be compatible with representationalism. So, do you think that this? Do you agree that this kind of view would have a similar implication? Do you think that it could be compatible with your view, or?
Could you please repeat what the view says, the view that you're comparing? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yes, the view just says that the very same representations and mechanisms underlying sensory motor abilities or sensory motor skills are those underlying higher cognition, so to speak, or mostly those mechanisms that are in charge of conceptual knowledge, semantic knowledge, and declarative memory.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, that sounds right. Meaning, well, two things. It sounds plausible, and also it's very compatible and mutually supportive of what I'm saying. Yeah.
I think we do not have Renis.
No, I was going to point out your mic, your microphone was muted. That's it.
Well, I think we do not have more questions, so we don't want to take more of your time. Gualtiero, thank you so much for your talk, for the lengthy discussion. Well, we hope to see you soon again.
Yeah, before another 10 years. But thank you very much for, again, for the invitation, for participating, for the questions. It was very helpful to me as well.
Thanks.
Take care.